Well, good morning. Okay. Happy Sunday, July 22nd, 2018. Welcome to the fifth in our series of Summer Forum speakers here at the First Unitarian Church in Salt Lake City. I have the honor to introduce Emeritus Dennis McCarty, who was a member of this church going back to the mid to late 1980s. And this church was a sponsoring church for Dennis when he went to study to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And between 2003 and 2015 was the first minister for the Columbus, Indiana church, which is south of Indianapolis, west of Cincinnati, east of Bloomington, if you know that area. Okay? So he's a playwright, a songwriter, a poet. And he's going to today present a wonderful presentation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have the offering. Then we'll go to questions and answers. I might add that we want to keep this door shut, so if anyone needs to get up for some reason, please exit through the back because of the sound system that we have for this presentation. So with that in mind, let's welcome Reverend Dennis McCarty.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'll start with a couple of disclaimers. One of them is, you've probably already observed I'm too short, fat, and bald to be Eric Clapton. I got most of my vocal training singing in the shower, and my instrumental training's about on the same level. I'm just plain folks, but I think the music is worth sharing. After all, I wrote it. And the other piece is, Reverend Tom Goldsmith and I were unable to get the stars lined up to actually do Servetus here, but we were able to at least talk about it for a morning. That's what we're going to do. And Tom, when I first told Tom I was planning to study for ministry, he said, well, one of the intimidating aspects of Unitarian Universalist ministry is that it doesn't matter what you talk about, you're likely to be talking to somebody out there who knows more about it than you do. And I have little doubt that that's probably the case this morning, at least for part of what I'm going to say. And it is what it is. But this is sort of dramatic theory 101R. But hopefully interesting. But I want to thank Reverend Goldsmith and First Church and Tim and Kathy Chambliss for having me in here this morning. I'll share a few selections from this musical and also some of the choices I made in writing it and what I was thinking about when I wrote it, and then try to expand from there to the broader topic of historical drama in general. Because I think we sometimes forget. Certainly, it's easy to do. Michael Servetus himself, he's the topic of the play. Approximately 1511 to 1553 were his dates. He's seen as a kind of Unitarian Universalist martyr, but he was not actually Unitarian. His views would be perfectly at home in any liberal Trinitarian Christian church today. All the same, he so disturbed church fathers in 1553 that Reformed church leader John Calvin felt justified burning him at the stake for heresy. One of his big mistakes was that Servetus believed that human reason and diligence could gain religious fulfillment, salvation, if you will, without a church to tell us what to think. And to church fathers in 1553, that was anathema. Reason was a tool of Satan. Calvin pretty much said as much. And so do religious fundamentalists in our own day. So I wrote my play about Servetus, not just because the history intrigues me, but also to explore religious themes that I think are still with us. But even when it's about history, drama, whether we're talking theater or motion pictures, drama is not history. History, to me, is the work of deducing, trying to understand what went on in the past, isolate it and understand it, while drama, even historical drama, asks questions and makes statements about the present. Okay, so drama, even if it's historical drama, I claim is rooted in the present. So many of the choices I made in writing this piece were dramatic. They were not historical, or they were ahistorical. And playwrights and screenwriters make these kinds of choices all the time. Drama can use history to explore themes that are rooted in the present, and good historical drama can, I think, open a door and invite you to explore farther on your own, find out what really happened. But that still doesn't make it history, and not itself. All the same, I did try to capture the spirit of the Protestant Reformation. The Renaissance, of course, brought great advances in science and the arts, but the Reformation was kind of the other side of that coin. Religion still centered on authority. People would live and die for faith, but they would also kill for faith as well, or more precisely, to assert the authority of their particular religious institution. Christianity, of course, split into factions. Wars broke out and raged off and on for more than 100 years, killing millions. And that was Christians killing other Christians for not being Christian in the right way. So, religion was dangerous business during the Reformation, and I think that tension still exists today just below the surface. It's certainly more muted, but it's still there. Try being a minister in Indiana and you'll see. And that was what I was trying to get to in the opening number, which is titled, Welcome to the Age of Belief. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the age of belief. 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 God is in his heaven and the world is right, underneath the eyes of holy fathers. God is in his heaven and the world is right, except that is unless you're Martin Luther. Martin Luther sings, I took a 95 thesis and I hung 'em on a wall. A priest that lies and takes a bribe is surely gonna fall. Degrading old St. Peter's thrown into a toilet seat. So how you gonna save your soul? You got to save your soul. Oh, you got to save your soul. Welcome to the age of belief. 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 God is in his heaven and the world is right. And if you're good enough, you'll go there with him. God is in his heaven and the world is right. Except that is unless you're John Calvin. John Calvin sings, we got a big problem, baby, 'cause you know we're living in a cesspool of depravity and every kind of sin. We're all disgusting, rotten fruit. We don't deserve to live. So how you gonna save your soul? You got to save your soul. Oh, you got to save your soul. The problem with eternity is that it lasts forever. You got one chance to get it right, no way to do it over. But God is in his heaven and the world is right. God is in his heaven and the world is right. as long as you don't get it wrong, not likely. As long as you don't get it wrong. Thank you. Needless to say, if I don't hang myself with my neck tight, you know what? Needless to say, neither Michael Servetus nor Martin Luther nor John Calvin were in the habit of singing blues-based rock and roll music. I was very consciously looking back at their time to examine themes in our own time. And I think I'll just lose that guy. I did have a lot of what's really pretty dry historical context that I had to get out there, so I decided to have a narrator, sort of along the lines of the Che Guevara character in the Weber and Rice musical Evita. And in fact, I saw dramatic and thematic opportunity in a narrative dialogue between two characters that I could use to symbolize two quite broad, maybe even simplistic types of Unitarian Universalists I've met. The angry atheist type, which I've been, and a rather overeducated above-it-all type, which I've also been. For the angry UU, I selected an obscure historical character named Judith de Burgh. More on her later. Suffice to say, Judith despises churches and preachers. She's cynical, profane, but highly intelligent, my kind of woman. And in her leitmotif, she sings, "Preachers say that I ought to be soft and obedient, follow the rules that are written, of course, by them. But I know who I am at the end of the day. Swallow this with your dram, that I don't give a good tinker's damn what preachers say." That's Judith. And as a foil for Judith, I chose the Renaissance scholar Desiderius Erasmus. And Erasmus actually was one of many scholars who did correspond with Michael Servetus, and they all found Servetus's religious views problematic, to say the least. Historically, Erasmus actually died 10 to 15 years before Servetus went on trial for heresy, but again, drama is not history, and for me, Erasmus was the perfect figure to set against Judith. He's knowledgeable, a little overeducated. I thought they would make very suave. I thought they'd make a very lively pair for conversation. Michael Servetus himself also had a brilliant mind. He was a genius in languages, letters, geography, the sciences, also medicine, and in fact, up until quite recently, the last 15 or 20 years certainly, more of his writings were held in medical school libraries around the world than in theological school libraries. I found that out when I was looking for them. But of course, his most passionate interest was religion, and that's how we Unitarian Universalists remember him. What Servetus was apparently not good at was getting along with people. He corresponded with all the prominent religious thinkers of his day, and they all despised him. Not just because his views were unorthodox, though that was certainly bad enough, but he could also be, I think the technical term is just plain obnoxious. He did not seem to relate to people well, and particularly, it would seem, the very people he most wanted to connect with. He published his best-known book on the errors of the Trinity in 1531 while he was still in his 20s, probably his early 20s. So it was a work of some genius. But his comments on the doctrine of the Trinity were actually just technical adjustments. He lived and died a Trinitarian. But here's my version of how the Church Fathers responded. It's heresy. some troublemaker would print such a thing. It's heresy that he would even tell the world his name. It's heresy. He ought to be dismembered limb from limb, this awful, awful, awful man. Well, how can Servetus respond to a reaction like that? But I only was trying to show how the Holy is with us. Without doctrine or formula, reason and love fill the need. All the answers we seek may be found in a quest, in the searching for wisdom. Then it's easy to see how God wishes each person Godspeed, he sings. It's heresy. Authority must be the basis of our faith. It's heresy. It's firmly set in our tradition's plan. It's heresy. He tries to make us look like imbeciles, this awful, awful, awful man. And in point of fact, Servetus's book caused such an uproar that he changed his name and he went into hiding as a medical student at the University of Paris. And I wanted to capture his clumsiness in dealing with people, so I wrote a duet for Servetus and a potential girlfriend. She likes him, but he's absolutely clueless how to respond to her. By the eastern wall of Paris, walking up the slopes of Hill St. Genevieve, he sings, past these sacred halls of learning at the university. Here's a place for starting over, building up a new life out of old. Hear the choir singing at the Abbey, across the square from where the books are sold. He's singing about books. She wants to sing about love. Such a lovely time to be in Paris. Lovers stroll the winding cobbled ways. She sings, afternoons and crowds are warm and there's a fragrance to the days. Vendors cry their products' virtues. Widows sing from window frames above. Oh, how lovely to be here in Paris. Oh, how lovely to be here in love. But Servetus just doesn't get it. See the workers cutting stone to build a new church with a lovely edifice, he sings, named for Saint Etienne the martyr, who by mobs was stoned to death. 15 centuries gone by now, but we still remark his name with grace. Oh, echoes on the hill, St. Genevieve, such a faithful, educated place. Meanwhile, another student was also starting out at the University of Paris at almost exactly the same time, with a very different attitude toward Paris and a very different attitude toward religion as well. John Calvin. Look out, Paris, Calvin's coming, seeking fortune, nothing less. Nothing else could draw my footsteps to this sink of worldliness. Paris doesn't give me pleasure, but the future calls to me. God, you know I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to be. Crooked alleys, crooked streets, smelly refuse falling down, human trash and sweat and stenches. Paris is a crooked town. Looking down upon this madness, God is mightily displeased. He will punish with a vengeance when his anger is released. Hopefully everybody's awake now. Given the Reformed Church's attitude toward music, I would question whether Calvin sang much at all, let alone three-chord heavy metal. But to me, heavy metal was the perfect motif for Calvin's theology, which I just personally find pernicious. I'm not as bothered by the stark determinism of Calvinism, though it's very deterministic, as I am by its view of human nature. Total depravity is the term, and in the play I quote the Calvinist Westminster Confession of Faith, that people are, quote, fallen in original sin, seducing and seduced by Satan, sinning, sinful, dead in sin, ungodly, defiled, corrupt, most wicked, lustful, hardened against God, and let this one sink in, utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good. Utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and completely inclined to all evil, close quote. Now, I reread the Westminster Confession every so often just for shock value, but that's what Calvinist theology means when it refers to total depravity. And for what it's worth, I have come to realize that actually Mormon doctrine is much kinder and gentler than Calvinism was, which may be one reason, one of its attractions in the mid-1800s. And yet, the Westminster Confession is a foundational creed for Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, several other traditions, most of whom have long since moved forward and left it behind. Okay, it's just a historical document, not terribly relevant, but that disdain for the human condition, unspoken, but still lingering just below the surface, still grounds certainly religious fundamentalism in our day. And also, our Unitarian Universalist first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of each person, has very deep roots because it's rooted in the liberal religious response to that total depravity. That's our part of the dialogue, is our first principle. So that tension is still there. It's under the surface. Going back to John Calvin and Michael Servetus, they met at the University of Paris, where they were both students, him in medicine and Calvin in theology, and they seem to have been at loggerheads right from the beginning. They actually arranged a religious debate, but Servetus was much better known at the time. Calvin was pretty much unknown, and Servetus didn't bother to show up. And Calvin seems not to have forgotten or forgiven that slight. But there was a religious crackdown soon after. Both fled Paris. Servetus became a doctor in southern France, and Calvin fled to Basel, where he wrote his what's called the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which made him famous, and later he became Reformed Church leader in Geneva, Switzerland, where many years later he wound up having Servetus arrested and burned at the stake. Now, my play follows Calvin to Geneva and depicts his wedding to a widow named Idelette de Burgh, and that's where, small spoiler alert, the audience finds out that Judith de Burgh, my female protagonist, knows Calvin because she's Calvin's stepdaughter. Historically, she was 11 years old when Calvin married her mother. Her father had died of the plague. And I depict Judith as an attendant at the wedding with flowers in her hair and flowers in her hands. And she's still grieving for her father. And after the wedding, she is alone on stage singing this song. If you can picture an 11-year-old with John Calvin as a stepfather. How strange it's been these last 2 years since Father went away, she sings. Don't know exactly where he went, they don't exactly say. They say he's in a better place where every heart is light. And if my father's happy, I guess that's all right. The world is full of changes, sometimes I could use a hand, she sings. But no one tells me anything, they say I wouldn't understand. My mother said she wasn't sad, but sometimes she would cry. And if I watched, she'd smile a smile that never reached her eyes. But now we're in this big new house, her eyes are sometimes bright. And if my mother's happy, I guess that's all right. And while Judith sings, Calvin comes walking back into the room. He's irritated, Calvin is. He's obviously upset about something that happened. And he watches this girl singing to herself. The world is full of changes, sometimes all the old things fall. New cities, houses, neighbors, I just don't understand it all. And then she shrugs her shoulders and smiles a little smile to herself and sings this. Oh, my mother says I'm growing, old clothes no longer fit. And sometimes when men look at me, I'm scared a little bit. Oh, I don't know about the future, but I hope the future's bright. And if I grow up pretty, I guess that's all right. Yes, I guess that's all right. And suddenly Calvin shouts at her, "Shut up! Don't play in here. Make yourself useful. Go cook something, clean something." And she says, "I wasn't doing nothing wrong." And he says, "Don't speak that way. Don't speak like some kind of peasant." And she says, "Well, don't you talk that way neither. You're not my father. You're not my father." And Calvin reaches out and catches her by the wrist and hauls her to her feet and drags her off the stage. He drags her out of the room. And there's silence. And then after a time, Judith walks back onto the stage alone. She's obviously badly shaken. She's dropped her flowers. And she sings another song. There's more kinds of mysteries in this world I'll never know, she sings. Like why does the rain blow in off the sullen sea? Why is there lightning? Why do lambs die in the snow? How could you do that to me? I don't even know you. You're a stranger in my life. I never done nothing for to cause you misery. I just wanna hide somewhere, maybe just curl up and die. How could you do that to me? never go back, I'll never go back, or trust you again, or trust you again, and you'll never mean nothing to me. I'd rather be cold, and sleep in the rain, and sleep in the rain. How could you do that? How could you do that? How could you do that to me? There's bigger misfortunes in this world, so I heard tell, she sings, like war and disaster, sickness, plague, calamity. I don't know how many ways there are to live in hell. How could you do that to me? I'll never go back, I'll never go back, or trust you again, or trust you again, and you'll never, no never, no never mean nothing to me. I'd rather eat dirt or sleep out in the rain. How could you do that? How could you do that? How could you do that to me? And thus ends the first act in the play. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you. What I was trying to get at with that, at a very personal human level, was Calvin's unsympathetic nature, of course, but also what I personally see as the abusive potential in Calvinism itself, or that level of religious fundamentalism. I certainly would expect that scene to arouse a bit of controversy, but I do stand behind it, dramatically, thematically, and even historically. Historically, as one of my sources that I use put it, quote, Judith tended to flaunt her sexuality, and after one of her more public affairs, Calvin wrote in a letter that for days he was too ashamed to even leave his house. Now, in 1550s Geneva, that the stepdaughter of the world's foremost Protestant leader slept around is striking, to say the least. And that tells me that something happened between them. And after all, how remarkable would it be that a teenager in any age would defy an authoritarian stepfather at some level, or that the authoritarian stepfather would react badly. Now, I don't know what went down between them, if it was just mutual hatred or something more severe, nor do I specify. I leave it to the imagination. But I do believe that certainly discord, if not abuse, took place. Again, that's my opinion. But a dramatist's job is to create drama, not to record precise history. A historian would need to label speculation. But the dramatist or the novelist takes that speculation and runs with it, particularly for thematic purposes, which brings us to the symbolism I was after, namely what I see as the abusive nature of Calvinism itself. In my view, any doctrine that an abstract God is everything and the person standing in front of you is nothing is a license to kill. It justifies whatever it takes to uphold that God, no matter how violent or cruel it may be, which is exactly why religious authorities felt justified burning hundreds, if not thousands, of people at the stake over the centuries. And as far as that's concerned, it's the kind of theology that can also justify a terrorist flying an airplane into a building. Only the name of the deity changes. The theology is exactly the same to me. On a more personal level, I watched my grandmother, my father's mother. She was a simple, good-hearted soul brought up fiercely Calvinist. And I witnessed her waning years. She was terrified of dying. She believed that she faced eternity in hell, and determinism being what it is, nothing she could do about it. Her whole childhood, she'd been reminded of her own depravity. Every mistake in a very long life reinforced fear that she was among the non-elect, the damned. And to me, that kind of doctrine is abusive at its very core. So whatever Judith de Boer's historical details might have been, I felt she was the perfect figure to symbolize that kind of religious abuse. And also, and this is important, defiance against it. Now, Servetus is just one more than obscure play, but I also offer it as a lens for historical drama's broader purpose. Drama can open a door and invite us to look into the history more deeply, but again, drama centers on contemporary attitudes and issues, and that's easy to forget sometimes. I've watched colleagues who would laugh at someone taking the Bible literally, but go to a historical movie and expect to be able to take that literally. And this can actually get into social justice territory, which is a little more serious than Servetus. A case in point from a few years ago is the movie Selma, which is historical drama. Of course, it was mostly praised, sometimes highly praised, but it was also criticized for not being sufficiently historically accurate, particularly in its depiction of President Lyndon Johnson. But again, drama is not history other than the broadest sense in inviting us to look deeper. As background, and really the only reason I picked up on this, it certainly wasn't because I was smarter than everybody else or anybody else, it was just different experience. I took a couple of courses at the University of Chicago Divinity School on black theology. And one of the themes that kept popping up right from the 1960s on in what's called black theology, and of course it was in black theology because it's in black life. One theme was the fragility of black life and also black hope. Of course that's still playing out in the Black Lives Matter movement, but it also came up several times in Selma. They repeated it. Right from the beginning. You may remember if you've seen the movie that I think the second scene in the movie shows the 4 little African-American girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing. And they go back to that theme repeatedly during the movie. Another theme from black theology, again, it's in black theology because it's in black life, that they went back to repeatedly. How can I say this delicately? Is black frustration with white allies, like me, for example. Because sometimes we show up, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we humbly listen to African Americans trying to explain their experience, which is very different from white liberal experience, but sometimes we don't. And that's also a major theme that Selma gets back to time and again. Gets back to time and again. Frustration with white allies. For example, one of the least quoted lines from the movie, at one point, one African-American organizer says to another, quote, "We have to make something happen while the white folks are here. You know they're not going to stay around for long." And that line is tucked in so neatly. I think if a person wasn't primed for it, you likely wouldn't even hear it. And I've never heard anyone else mention it. But it certainly struck me. Of course, historically, there was also frustration with the government's attitude toward civil rights, including the Kennedy administration. On one hand, Kennedy supported civil rights in principle, and landmark civil rights legislation was, of course, put forth on his watch. But on the other hand, with his sensitivity to political winds, Kennedy's support for civil rights and Martin Luther King was not always consistent, and sometimes it was frustrating. Famously, Kennedy's people were ready to pull the plug on King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech if he were to say anything too controversial. Of course, Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, so Lyndon Johnson was president during the Selma voting rights marches. And Johnson was a more reliable ally than Kennedy had been. But look at the dramatic challenges facing the scriptwriters of a 2-hour movie. Dramatically, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to depict Kennedy at any depth. I mean, that would be a side trip that would derail the whole narrative drive of the movie. So, much more efficient, they simply put some of Kennedy's inconstancy onto Johnson, particularly early on. The theme was black frustration with white allies, and that frustration was real. And if you read black theology from the 1960s, you'll find it all over the place, sometimes very pointed. But of course, we didn't hear much about it. I didn't hear much about it at the time as a white person, not least because King and the civil rights workers didn't want to alienate the white allies they had. So thematically, dramatically, the movie's treatment of Johnson was a perfectly acceptable historical tweak. But to some white audiences and critics, it received sometimes harsh criticism because it wasn't sufficiently historically accurate. White critics and some of my colleagues did not pick up on the thematic reason behind the dramatic choice. And I only knew about it, again, because of the classes I'd taken. It made me a little more sensitive to it from divinity school. So this is relevant on multiple levels. You can apply this to certainly other movies on historical topics. And there's also, if you spend much time on UUA and ministers' chat sites, there's a lot of conversation in the Unitarian Universalist Association right now about, quote, quote, white supremacy, which is an uncomfortable term. It's a very uncomfortable term. But really, critical response to Selma is a nice, learnable pocket example of just how white supremacy can work. The dominant culture, white culture, was able to lay out the groundwork rules for judging Selma without needing to know or think about the deeper thematic cultural currents in the movie. Again, drama centers on contemporary attitudes and issues. Whoops, wrong page, I'm sorry. I've now walked out and basically kicked a couple of hornets' nests. These are deep and rich subjects. They deserve a lot of conversation. We've only got 40 minutes plus discussion time. So I've barely scratched the surface on either of them. Going back to my play about Michael Servetus, I have no doubt that if it got the exposure of a film like Selma, it'd be controversial as well, which would be fine with me. I'd love it to be controversial. I'd love that exposure, and I'd like to think I'd welcome it. But I think we've got a lot to talk about now, so I'm going to call it just leave it right there. Again, I want to thank First Unitarian Church, the Chamblises, and Tom for the opportunity to share a little bit, a tiny bit, on a couple of my favorite topics. And I will assume we will have lots of lively conversation after the offering.
And we will pass the plate, and then we will go to questions and answers.
Tim asked me if I wanted to do something musical during the offering, so I'll share with you Judith's theme song, subtitle, Preachers Say. You find out why I love this young woman. Preachers say, she sings, that a woman's a delicate flower, a petal to drift on the word of the church. Preachers say that a woman's a sink of iniquity, luring you down to the depths of desire. Ha! You should long for the day, but that's what preachers say. Who am I, she asks, but a pilgrim who walks in a shadow, a pathway beyond your scholarly glow. Who am I? But a vessel no weaker than you, who has wandered a land where you'd never dare go. In your comfortable candlelit study, you never will read a book written like me. So don't stand there and stare as though I shouldn't dare. I'll walk my own way. I assure you I really don't care what preachers say. Preachers say, she sings, that I ought to be soft and obedient, follow the rules that are written, of course, by them. Preachers say, if I fall, it's a failure in me, and whatever he does, it's still my weakness and sin. But I know who I am at the end of the day. Swallow this with your dram, that I don't give a good tinker's damn what preachers say. What preachers say.
Okay, we're going to go to questions and answers. We'll alternate each side of the church, and maybe even looking for that first question. You're acting like my students. Okay, Mark, you're going to be the first.
So let me get you the microphone. I need to give instruction for how to use this after last week. I had to get instruction myself. You should hold the microphone 2 to 5 inches from your mouth, and it will work fine. Thank you. And because we're recording it, that's why we need to have the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for addressing us. Having been a minister in Indiana and having also lived in Utah, I'd like to hear your impressions of how the congregations compare. And specifically, is there more Calvinism in Indiana or Utah?
That's a really good question. Golly, where to start? We could be here a while. One thing I probably ought to mention is, of course, the English Calvinists were the Puritans, and we're descended from them. We actually are not directly descended in any way from European Unitarians. So it's not like it's all, an all bad tradition. It gave rise to us, so they have something going on. Indiana, Columbus, Salt Lake's a little I don't know, schizophrenic, is that the right term? You know, because there's, especially in this part of town, there is both religious and social liberalism in a pretty strong degree. But other places, you know, as you get farther out of this corner of the valley, not so much. Indiana is quite interesting because it's not a college town. Columbus is not. It's actually a very corporate town. Cummins Diesel, which is a worldwide multinational corporation, have their headquarters there. So there is that difference, and it's a palpable difference between the congregations. That this one, you know, it tends to be, at least when I was here, a more university-based congregation. Although there were plenty of other folks, I was a lowly construction worker myself, and again, I think, you know, I'm well aware that living with the LDS Church is kind of like living with a 600-pound gorilla. On the other hand, they're pretty corporate, I find, and pretty practical. And again, Mormon theology, LDS theology, was fundamentally gentler than this bedrock Calvinist theology, and it's pretty strong in the Midwest there, either in cases like say the Dutch Reformed Church, which is around the area where I interned, which still very influenced by that doctrine, or the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which of course Lutheranism was a bit different, you know, had a bit different history, but they still kind of subscribe to it in principle, maybe without. And of course Calvin didn't invent depravity; he just put that term on it. You know, that the whole thing about being a fallen humanity was that we could do nothing on our own, that we were incapable on our own, and that was almost universal. Did that answer your question at all?
I want to thank you again for coming and enlightening us with some of the history that is so relevant to us. And I also want to thank you for broaching a very uncomfortable term. I think it is quite evident from my accent, I'm not from here originally. But I lived the civil rights era. And of course, our organization is struggling very much with white supremacy. We're attempting to understand it. And I would invite our congregation, I had the privilege of going to GA again this year, to listen to the Ware lecture that was delivered. It's an annual on Saturday night of the General Assembly. But this year's is particularly enlightening. Thank you again.
Good comment. Can I comment on that? Because I wonder if we were going. When I left Salt Lake City in the late '90s, I find it seems like the Salt Lake Valley is a lot more diverse now than it was when I lived here. And certainly when I went to Chicago to study at Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is the UU Divinity School in Chicago, it was an education, and I was struck by my own prejudice. I might have said beforehand that I was unprejudiced, or at least, you know, not. But what I found, just monitoring my own feelings, is that meeting somebody I didn't know, if it was a person of color, I was much more likely to react badly, or to react, for my radar to switch on. I could feel my radar switching on much more readily. So it was certainly there in me. And it was a real education in dealing with it, because of course, if you're going to go to Hyde Park, Chicago, you're going to deal with diversity. And it was so I like to say I got a good education in Chicago and learned some things in theological school while I was at it.
Question right here.
I would first like to just thank you for your wonderfully elegant and witty and educational performance today.
Thank you.
And where can we see more of you?
Well, again, we weren't able to get the stars to line up for an actual Servetus performance. So I'm headed out to Corvallis, Oregon next week. So that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer. But I do pass through Salt Lake City every once in a while because I have some history and some relatives here. So get in touch. We can probably work something out. And thank you. That's very heartwarming, by the way.
Yep.
Hi. How old was Servetus when he was burned at the stake?
42. Assuming we have the right birth date for him, but it would have been in his 40s, which on one hand was a pretty ripe old age for, the 1550s. On the other hand, burning at the stake was just a really ugly way to go. We probably don't want the gory details, so I won't give them. But they went out of their way to make it an unpleasant experience. Pardon?
There are two different ways to be burned at the stake.
Well, what it was, they would use green wood that would barely burn. And the idea would sputter and pop and smoke and spark, and so it was a very slow process. Give you plenty of time to repent if you were so inclined.
So it's readily apparent that from the standpoint of Calvin, the underlying assumption of his theology is people are no damn good, and that's an understanding thing. I've said it on occasion myself. What was Servetus's underlying opinion with regard to humanity?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question.
Now, just as an aside, it's occurred to me over and over again with regard to Mormonism. The underlying assumption of Mormonism is that we are all embryonic gods in a meritocracy. That's Mormon doctrine.
There's something to be said for that. I mean, again, the depravity piece is not just that people are screwed up. I agree we are screwed up. I've lived with myself for almost 70 years. I know. But it's that that we are the opposite to all good. Now, that's a pretty heavy statement. Servetus, there's a passage where I have not read his magnum opus, which is called The Restoration of Christianity, and I have to mention that he titled it specifically to get Calvin's goat. Because Calvin had written the Institutes of the Christian Religion, Servetus wrote the Restitution of Christianity because he believed the Institutes had perverted Christianity. He may be onto something there. But at the end of On the Errors of the Trinity, which again was just really technical adjustments, he still believed in the Trinity. There was a passage where he wrote along the lines of, this may seem hard to understand, but you can get this. If you really work hard at it, you can get it. He says, read the Bible 1,000 times and the answers will come. The door will open if you knock ceaselessly. Now, that's the opposite of what Calvinist theology said. It makes very clear that if you are not among the elect, and most people weren't, as the assumption, that no matter how hard you prayed or tried to do good works, etc., 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 you were still not among the elect. Now, of course, Catholic theology was works-based, but Calvinist theology wasn't. So Servetus did, so that the big difference between Servetus and most doctrine at the time was what in theological circles we call anthropology, which is not the science of anthropology, it's the human condition vis-a-vis God. And Servetus did believe we were capable of figuring it out, and without necessarily even a church involved. And of course, Catholic doctrine was the church had to be involved because your salvation, the sacraments were administered through them. and Calvin, the other churches kind of accepted that. So it was a fundamental difference, and it was a big difference. And yeah, the burgeoning God piece, if you don't square it up, that's maybe closer to Servetus than to Calvin anyway.
Yes, I'll ask the next question. That is, historically, the civil rights movement was led by black ordained ministers. Leaders have been denied access through the political process, through the academic community. So it was the churches that led the movement. You made reference to Selma, March 7th, 1965, Edmund Pettus Bridge. Can you speak more specifically about that relationship, that symbiotic relationship between Lyndon Johnson and the power of the political process he had in conjunction with Dr. King, and the partnership they had to be able to bring about meaningful change?
Well, the complaints I heard were in the movie. King basically has a hard time talking Johnson into, introducing voting rights legislation. And my understanding is, and as it was explained to me historically, actually Johnson was very much behind voting rights. So that in that respect, it was somewhat portraying in a Johnson, at least early on, in a dimmer light than what he deserved. Does that get you there?
Well, I'm looking for a little more of a detailed answer, because Johnson was a very impatient man, and basically Kennedy's call for gradualism was something Dr. King rejected in his I Have a Dream speech, rejecting gradualism, saying,
I'm sorry.
saying the future is now. The future is now. How long? Too long. And so here now, dealing with a new president, Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson, son of the South, is willing to be the radical and work using the governmental process in partnership with Dr. King, rallying the African American community and the religious communities together for ultimately success, 3 unprecedented civil rights bills. I'm wondering if you could tie that in with what could have potentially happened in the 1500s. It didn't happen.
I think Servetus was incapable of, one thing about Calvin, you can love him or hate him, but he was a brilliant administrator. And he was the kind of person who would be a brilliant church leader. Servetus was an iconoclast. He was hard to get along. Not that Calvin wasn't hard to get along with. Servetus was hard to get along with. There is no way he could have put together a lasting church tradition the way Calvin did. He was just sort of this, you could call him prophetic character out there with his finger in the air. Am I there yet?
We can work
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, because ultimately what's going to happen with Europe is people are going to leave. They're going to vote with their feet. They're going to head for the New World and try to make a better life there, because of the inability to be able to bring about meaningful change in Europe in the 1500s.
Well, there's a little more to it than that.
Okay.
Well, the way I see this is that one, and this applies to Kennedy, is intellectually based, and the other, which applies to your character as well as LBJ, is emotional based. LBJ was very emotional based. He was strongly driven, so he was more likely to respond quickly to anything presented to him, whereas Kennedy always gathered in a whole room of advisors. So I sort of see Calvin as this intellectual, and your character is sort of this emotional based person who's constantly pissing everybody off, as I can say.
Okay. I like that.
Actually, sort of following up on that discussion, did the church influence politics in Europe at that time as much as the church seems to influence politics now?
Oh, more. Certainly, as of the 1550s, separation of church and state were virtually unheard of. And really, without some kind of state connection, a church was in, or a religious body of people was in real trouble. What we call, the title of the play comes from what's called the Radical Reformation, which was Unitarians, Anabaptists, and the like. And they had a really rough time because very rarely were they connected to government institutions. Really, to the extent that the religious wars of the Reformation started sorting themselves out, that was sorted out along the base of, well, okay, the government in this spot likes Lutheranism, so it's going to be Lutheran, and the government in this locale likes Reformed Church, so it's going to be Reformed, et cetera, et cetera.
So, I would love to see this as a play. The Salt Lake Acting Company was born in this church. It might be a great venue to, in the future, maybe contact their playwrights or the people at Salt Lake Acting Company to see how it might be presented as a real play. Are you looking at venues and places to maybe put it on? Because I bet if it was on at the Salt Lake Acting, I mean, it's considered a radical reform musical, much like, let's see, Saturday Voyeur that is going on right now. So I'm just as my idea. I just wondered if you had thought about maybe trying to get a performance actually here in the state of Utah and have it really on stage.
Here's the deal, what I've found out. I haven't written a lot of plays, but I've written a few, and I'm actually quite proud of this one. Writing a play is relatively easy. Getting it produced is really hard. And so actually I am on a one-person version of Servetus tour this summer. Again, I'll be in Oregon next. And the reason was what they call sheer desperation. Because I wasn't, I wasn't getting a lot of emails answered. So I thought, well, shoot, okay, let's turn it into a selection of songs and some dramatic readings, and I'll do it myself. And it's been people have been very kind. It's been very kindly received. Again, we weren't able to line things up to do it here this time through town. And I would certainly, and I've learned some things in just the one-person version of it. So I would, and rewrites are me. I would certainly want to go through it again if it were to be fully produced. It's actually written for a cast and garage band, if you're into rock and roll music. Part of my ministry now is to make Unitarian Universalism safe for lowbrow rock and roll music. So, yeah, you bet I'd be open to it being produced. I would want to go through it again. Or I'd be open to it, doing it here myself. So, yeah, let's stay in touch. If somebody with a facility, et cetera, would agree, I would certainly agree. And you'll love Judith. She's a pistol.
Are there any other questions? Question right here.
I'm curious about Judith, whether it seems like she would have been a target to be burned at the stake. Did Calvin protect her to some extent because she was family?
Yeah, in theory at least, that the punishment for adultery in Calvin's Geneva, once he got the full reins of power, was death. And how that played out with her is very hard to nail down. Except for a couple of mentions in Calvin's letters, she's really lost to history. So I don't know, if she wound up being banished or what became of her. Well, I don't think she was, but I did run across one mention of it. I can't remember what it was in, that she might have been, but I'm not sure they had the right person. So short answer is I don't know. But she would certainly be taking her chances. And again, that tells me that she was showing him something, that there, you know, that there's, again, that there's a reason somebody takes that kind of chance, you know, who is in a relationship with somebody like Calvin.
Final question here.
Thank you. Thomas Jefferson said that he swore eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. And it said that he based that to some extent on the philosophy of Servetus. But you've said that Servetus was through and through a Trinitarian. Do you really think that he was fundamentally founded in liberty?
Good question. Well, he certainly felt at liberty to dispute doctrine. Again, he was not an institutionalist himself. He was kind of this voice out in the wilderness. He was not going to really change things on his own, simply because he couldn't. He didn't kind of have the kind of personality that could build an organization or make something happen the way Luther and Calvin did. But he certainly did not feel constrained by the intellectual tyrannies of the time. He certainly felt free of them himself, although he was well aware when he got in hot water for errors, and then later when he got denounced after publishing his big book, that he needed to not stay where he was, because the Inquisition actually arrested him. And he escaped from them. So he knew some of what the odds were, but apparently he did not expect to be burned when he got to Geneva. He thought maybe they'd banish him or sentence him to a prison or something, but he didn't expect to be burned.
Let's express appreciation to very good. We have some quick announcements. Michelle. And then Jim's on deck.
Thank you. My name is Michelle McCarty, and I do attend this amazing church on occasion, you know, like typical Unitarian Universalist. This was a fascinating presentation. I think everybody really quite enjoyed it. I am here. You may or may not know, there is an event that's going to be held in Salt Lake City beginning August 2nd called the Donate Life Transplant Games. This is basically like the Olympics for people that have had a transplant. We will be bringing 44 teams from around the world to Salt Lake City, and I have 2,904 volunteer slots to fill between July 31st, we have a couple of volunteer things, between July 31st and August 7th. So opening ceremonies will be held at Smith's Ballpark. It's free to the public to attend. It's kind of a compilation of stories and musical performances from some bands. It's kind of a fascinating event. There will be kids as young as 3 or 4 participating in a little youth Olympiad, and I think the oldest gentleman is 82 that's competing this year. 21 competitive events and 16 special events, everything swimming, track and field, basketball. There's a ballroom dance competition, and then there are some things. Every team that comes is also required to bring a donor family along with them. So there are a lot of emotions of joy and tears and whatnot, but it's kind of a spectacular event. And so if you go to transplantgamesofamerica.org, you can register to volunteer, and please spread the word. They have a Facebook page, everything, but need a lot more volunteers. So that would be all. Thank you so much, Tim.
And Jim.
Very quickly, I know everybody wants to go home, but this white supremacy issue if you're familiar, followed at all some of the conflict and discomfort and Peter Morales' resignation, the president of the UUA back in the spring, it's something that is really, we're becoming really aware of, understanding better some of the things that were described today. And I invite you to look at the Ware lecture. It's always done on Saturday night at General Assembly, but if you'll just online look at the Ware, W-A-R-E, Ware lecture. It was a black woman that really, really enlightened the whole audience and is something I think we need to better understand. So, Ware lecture.
And one last thing is, next door in Elliott Hall, where we're going to gather, is a table for small group ministry. If you're interested, please, at that table, get more information. So with that in mind, thank you very much. Remember that next Sunday, July 29th, we will have our sixth in our series, Summer Forum Speaker Series, be Katherine Cantor. And she is the leader of the Better Boundaries movement that we've had for the last year and a half to 2 years to create a anti-gerrymandering commission that you'll have the opportunity to vote on November 6th. So if this is an issue very important to you, it certainly is to me. Hope to see you here next Sunday, July 29th for Katherine Cantor. She's very articulate. Thank you so much. Let's get together in Elliott Hall.